Maria Nugent is an associate professor in the School of History with decades of experience in the museum and heritage studies sector, where she has worked closely with Indigenous communities. And her presentation today touches on the outcomes of an ongoing work associated with two of her major research grants that address the violence of colonization and its legacies, mobilizing objects and beyond reconciliation. So I'll hand it over now to Maria.
Thanks for the invitation and everyone to be here. And that was great to come straight after Paul's very generous welcome, where you sort of feel like you're speaking into a context of language and continuity, and some of that touches on what I'm going to speak about in my 20 minutes. I'd also want to acknowledge the Darawal Nation, which is the group that I'm working with most closely around Botany Bay. So in March this year, it was announced that 4 spears that had been taken by the Endeavour voyage in 1770 in the aftermath of the first landfall on the east coast would be returned unconditionally to the Perouse Aboriginal community on Botany Bay. So the 4 spears and the public announcement by members of the Land Council. So Cook's encounter that day, as is now reasonably well known, was a violent affront involving him using his firearm against 2 Guigal men who sought to resist the landing. This is now well known. On their part, they had thrown stones as a deterrent and eventually launched a couple of spears that pierced the ground near some of the landing party but hit no one. The result not of poor aim, but rather considerable skill. That tense and violent standoff has since been the subject of a great deal of storytelling and myth-making that has produced, I think, its own kinds of epistemic violence, in which the conflict and responsibility for it has moved around the parties involved and for a time was eventually, was completely airbrushed out before coming back into view, and coming back into view through the sort of visual politics of Indigenous artists mainly. So I'm sort of interested in these couple of images, which are the main ones, which is how the spears become documented very much as weapons of war. And these ones obviously where the violence of the landing party sort of turn into a gesture of peace rather than a gesture or of an act of violence. So it's perhaps also better known these days that immediately after landing, the landing party went to the small village behind the beach where they found a bundle of about 40 or 50 spears, which they decided to confiscate for fear that they might be poisoned and later used against them in retaliation. So the potential for conflict, given their own kind of violent entry onto land, was clearly on their mind. And so this is, I think, an audacious act of theft and deprivation, not least because as soon as they got the cache of spears back to the ship, they quickly realised they were fishing spears, not weapons of war or indeed even hunting spears for hunting animals. It was very clear that, that most of them were fishing spears because they had seaweed in their prongs. Pretty clear that what they had got, and they were not poisoned. Okay. So as you know, I've been very interested in the kinds of representations, the colonial representations of that. But I like to contrast it with this image that was made on the spot by Tapaya, which sort of shows a fishing spear in use. So we've got this kind of series of displacements about what we know in 1770, what we don't act on, and then what we sort of mask in our colonial representations. And then we're back, I think, to a moment where the spears manifest all of these complexities around what has become a foundational encounter. So Ray Ingray, who is the director of the Kajaga Foundation at La Perouse and who we work with very closely, and who's been intimately involved in negotiating for the spears' return, has described the taking of the entire number of spears found at the village akin to closing down a supermarket. Having identified them as fishing spears, it's not recorded what happened to them, whether or not some were returned, or if they were all divided among the landing party, which was a common kind of practice. This image made by Tapia at Gamay, Botany Bay in 1770 suggests that at least one fishing spear was still in use the week the Endeavour was there. What we do know for sure is that upon his return to England, Cook gave 4 of these spears, maybe that was his cut, to his patron Lord Sandwich, who gave them to his alma mater, Trinity College at Cambridge University, where they were placed in a cabinet, perhaps cut down to fit, and where they stayed on a landing on a staircase in the Wren Library for many decades. In 1914, they were entrusted to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge, where they have since remained. Okay, so this is not sort of the main part of this paper, but I just might make the comment that although this is not the time or place to expand on it, it is worth saying how it's possible to read off the European accounts, including the theft of the spears, some of the Guigal people's responses to the violence that they experienced. It's not insignificant, for instance, that they were quick to secure their canoes. So they may have been deprived of their spears, they may have had some extras, but they were pretty sure to make sure that they didn't lose their canoes that week. Nor that they kept their distance, mostly pursuing what appears to be a policy of toleration, which I think ties in a bit with Paul's comments this morning, coupled with a notable reluctance to do anything that might rekindle or amplify the violence of the first day. So I'm very interested in these sorts of practices of how violence erupts, and then also practices for how it might be contained, but also how it might be reconciled in a particular way at the point of time that it happens. So reading the contours of violence and its avoidance or containment across the week-long encounter at Gamay illuminates cultural as well as individual practices and attitudes on both sides, such as Cook's tendency during the first voyage to, as historian Greg Denning put it, to often foreshorten a cultural lesson with a musket ball, and an evident desire on the Guigal side, and we could extend this to the Gugu Imita up at Cooktown, to contain eruptions of violence via staged and ritualised acts. What you don't get at Gamay Botany Bay is a kind of reconciliation of the violence that happened. You do get that up at Cooktown, or what's now called Cooktown, where the local people initiate a reconciliation act by breaking some spears and doing some other kind of cultural ritual events, and a reconciliation happens in place at the time. That doesn't happen at Botany Bay. Okay, so that's very brief kind of context for these spears that have come very quickly and visibly sort of back into view. Fast forward now from the 1770 event and the 2 centuries of representational production and politics that followed it to the present moment. So, as mentioned at the outset, a couple of months ago it was announced that the 4 spears would be returning unconditionally, legally transferred back into the ownership of Aboriginal people at the place from where they were taken. It's no secret that some members of the La Perouse Aboriginal community have long known about the spears that Cook took and have wanted to see and hold them. Women I worked with at La Perouse in the mid-1980s spoke of them and we read about them and they were then keen to reconnect with them. These are the ones that the elders spoke about is a common refrain that you hear in the community now. And occasional inquiries about the spears have been sent to the museum that holds them for some decades. So interest in them was not then and not even now worded explicitly in terms of repatriation, which is what we might expect given the sort of common public discourse around museums, the moment that we're in. So, and that's the way I suppose that the media, who always think that this has only just happened right this minute, convey the situation. Nolene Timbry, who's the chairperson, and she's here, of the local Aboriginal Land Council, and who has seen the spears at Cambridge University, considers repatriation as a word that museums use. As she often says, repatriation is for museums to figure out. And I think she makes a very subtle and important point, is that repatriation in a way won't happen until the museums have decided that it will. So here's an interesting case in which the interest in objects which are known to still exist in a museum are pursued, but they aren't pursued as a repatriation case until, in fact, the museum decides that repatriation is what they would like to do. So we can talk, I think, around that sort of politics, which plays out all the time in very different ways around different objects with different communities or individuals involved. So Nolene's key interest, and those of her contemporaries, is in access. And she sees it as her responsibility as chairperson of the local Aboriginal Land Council to make access to material culture in distant museums possible and for as many community members as possible. This is a quote from her. All we were really looking for at the outset of the process was community access, she said. And that might sound much easier and sort of more benign. Actually, it turns out to be incredibly logistically complex to do and incredibly expensive, and something that needs ongoing funding. So this is not to suggest that repatriation and access are unconnected or completely different. Repatriation is a form of access, of course, is it not? It's a kind of probably one of the best forms of access because the objects are close by. What it is to say is that pursuing other aims can sometimes eventually, and to some extent quite suddenly, end up with more than one dead to hope for, just as soon as it articulates with the growing powerful discourse and push from within museums to do the work of repatriation. So I think Nolene Timbrey is right, it's for museums to figure out. While they are figuring out, while they are doing that sort of institutional figuring out, community are pursuing these processes of connecting with and speaking for their material culture that is held a long way from home in institutions. So the point to underline, though, is that interest in and desire around the spears was and is not explicitly framed in terms of these other concepts that we might be familiar with, such as transitional justice or reparation for past wrongs, those sorts of paradigms which are sort of common in the contemporary moment, even if that is in part what does eventuate. So rather, the spears and indeed other objects are viewed as evocations of or material witnesses to what members of the La Perouse Aboriginal community know to be true about themselves and their culture and history, but what settler and metropolitan society in which they live so often denies them or discounts. And so I think this is a kind of slight shift which is productive and powerful. And I think it also does articulate with what Paul was saying. Thought about in this way, the spears and other historic objects speak back to that broader ignorance with which Aboriginal people in Sydney are confronted almost daily. It's not so much the foundational violence of the spear's confiscation, although that matters too. It is rather and also that the spears can represent or do represent continuity in presence, practice and knowledge that has for too long been unseen or only seen sceptically and in ways that can be sort of dismissive or belittling. And that's why I go back to those sort of 19th century images. Objects coming back then, whether permanently or initially only on loan, are, as James Clifford has put it, occasions for narrating one's own stories and histories in a kind of contemporary, ongoing way. As Ray Ingray explains, our elders have been teaching our young ones how to make spears for decades here. They're not that different from the 253-year-old ones. It's tangible evidence to our young kids that we haven't really changed that much. Despite our world changing around us, our cultural practices are very similar to the ways of our old people. So this then, I think, is quite different from approaches that dwell in and on loss and violence. And there's been, you'll know of other cases of pursuing repatriation return, which are worded and cast in that. The return is very much about compensating for the loss and the violence, and they are very different sorts of interactions between communities and museums. I'm probably running rapidly out of time. So redress lies in the recognition and renewal that the spears allow, and it is this framing that connects this particular example of museum work with the broader ambitions of the Beyond Reconciliation project that is being funded by the ANU Grand Challenge scheme. Now, as you know, reconciliation has been the dominant framework for so much contemporary history and culture work to date. But as Megan Davis, who I think always has something really incredibly interesting to say, not just about constitutional recognition, but about what Indigenous people around the country are saying about past, present and future, what she's recently explained in her quarterly essay is that reconciliation is simply a word that for many does not fit or no longer fits. So beyond reconciliation, we had the same sort of sense, so we came up with this project and thinking about, if we were to think beyond reconciliation or after reconciliation, what might it look like? So in the dialogues, this is from Megan, in the dialogues, the constitutional dialogues, our old people kept saying without prompting that reconciliation was the wrong word. They said it implied the restoration of friendly relations after a conflict, but they said we have never met. And I think that goes back to this idea that kind of within the context of the encounter, you can have the reconciliation with the strangers that you've met. More difficult when we take it and think that somehow in the present moment, others will probably know more, that can be achieved in a particularly sort of satisfactory way. We've got obviously plenty to learn from around the world. Davis goes on and says this is what the Uluru Statement stands for. It is a beginning. It's about recognition and it's about renewal and an invitation to come and meet with us. And I think that's where we're sort of at. Okay, so this is where I'm sort of trying to bring these projects together. The return of the spears is not solely or even explicitly then an attempt to make good the violent act that occurred in 1770 and their confiscation, even if that were possible. It is not about reconciling with the aggressors that were met that day and their sort of descendants, in a sense. It is rather another avenue or resource to continue to challenge the violence that denies Indigenous people recognition, and it offers yet another invitation to come and hear and learn from people whose histories, cultures, practices and stories the spears kind of engender and represent. So that's where I'm trying to go. I just want to finish by saying that there's our last point. It must be said there's a certain irony about the spears that is sometimes missed in the media coverage, and this is where I'll end. It's alluded to here in Nick Thomas's comments. Nick, you'll know, is the director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, where the spears are kept, and he's been instrumental, in fact, probably prompting the negotiation for their return. And he's also a partner investigator on our current project. So he says, it's been immensely rewarding to work with the La Perouse community to research these artefacts. We look forward to extending the partnership in the future. The spears are exceptionally significant. They are the first artefacts collected by any European from any part of Australia that remain extant and documented. They reflect the beginnings of a history of misunderstanding and conflict. Their significance will be powerfully enhanced through return to country. So the irony, only obliquely referenced here, is that the act of the theft of these spears, as well as what happened to them after they returned to England, is clearly documented. You can read about the confiscation in Cooks and Bakes journals. They do not try to disguise it. There's little of the obfuscation that becomes a feature of later colonial violent frontiers and episodes, including the collecting of and theft of Aboriginal people's material culture. And the subsequent gifting of the spears by Cook to his friend Lord Sandwich and the depositing of them in Trinity College is also clearly recorded. So in this sense, These spears are a rarity. They are an anomaly. For the clarity of the moral case that they present us with for their return. It's really hard to argue with the evidence in this case. Unlike the project that we are actually more involved in, which is to try to work out the story of all of the other stuff, the what else is there, which was one of the questions that was asked when it was announced that the spears would be returning. Everyone said, and what else is there? Our current project is looking at what else there is, and much of it sort of very poorly provenanced, and we don't know as much about it. I just want to finish with this point. Such objects as this demand fundamental research that will be done in collaboration with Aboriginal co-researchers to reconstruct knowledge, lest a violence is done again to Aboriginal Sydney, ignored or overlooked in the current rush to repatriation, because its particular colonial history poses too many thorny challenges and difficult dilemmas to determine the kinds of provenance on which repatriation still and necessarily depends. Okay, that's my last point. And this is a topic that we're exploring in Wagga next week. A number of us who work in this area are getting together under the Beyond Reconciliation project. It's online and in person, so if you can make it, please join us.